Good. So it should be okay when we get to the PowerPoint. All right, so that's what we'll go ahead and do. Good morning, guys. I really appreciate y'all for signing in and checking us out. This is a new thing for all of us. It's definitely not how I intended to spend part of my teaching career. I really hope that you are taking advantage of this time off from school. Being a new or relatively new father and just having the past couple weeks off from school, I've been able to watch my daughter take her first steps by herself, and now she's walking and running all over the place. Spending time with my wife, working in the yard, working on the garden. It's like stepping back in time about 100 years, back whenever people didn't have all the problems that we have today. But they had disease. So it's, time moves on. And it's foolish of us to think that we're better than previous generations. So, we're going to talk about chapter 16. It's one of my favorite chapters in the book because it talks about the problems between the North and the South leading up to the Civil War. And it also tackles the slavery question again, which is something that has been skated around this whole time, from the time of talking about the Declaration of Independence all the way through the Articles of Confederation and making the Constitution, the first nullification crises. And we're skipping over a lot of stuff. Like, because of being out from school, we've had to skip over chapters 13, 14, and 15, which have a lot of background information for this time period. That's why I assigned you so much work for this week with questions from those chapters, just so you see the material a little bit. We'll be talking about chapter 16, which goes all the way up to the Civil War, and then the next chapter, 17, kind of skates back a little bit to the 1840s and talks about manifest destiny. So we're going back and forth a bit, but this is the beginning of the third part of this book of your 9th edition Brief American Pageant. And this is the last part of the book that we talk about in 1301, because it takes us all the way to Reconstruction. So hopefully, by the time we get to chapter 18 or 19, we'll actually be back in the classroom again. I have my fingers crossed that we go back to the classroom, because I really enjoy teaching this face-to-face and seeing what y'all get out of it. But if not, let's start to learn. All right, so since I don't have two screens, one to monitor my recording equipment and then the other one to actually present off of, my transitions are pretty sloppy. I'm not a professional. I wish I was. I've been watching a lot of videos over the past week or so of how to work this software, and there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with it. Maybe when we get that stimulus check, I'll put a new hard drive and some more RAM into this computer and see what it can do. It's a 2007. It's a 2007. Whenever y'all were in maybe not even pre-K yet. It's a 2007 iMac, so we might be pushing its bounds here. All right, so let me pull up my PowerPoint here, and let me figure out how to switch my scene. Give 1 second here. All right. I gotta wait for the lag so I can make sure that I'm in the correct spot. There we go. Wow. Okay. So, chapter 16, the South and the Slavery Controversy, as my German professor used to say. Let me switch this into presentation mode. Again, this is a Mac, so I don't buy the software. I don't buy the software. I don't buy Microsoft software. Haven't ever bought Microsoft software since the 1990s. So this is an open source program called OpenOffice, and that's what I use when I don't use Google on the browser. Let me answer this. Lantre asked when we're going back to school, and I honestly don't know. The president had a press conference on Sunday and recommended the end of April. So we have a whole month of this. So I really do hope that y'all are taking the time to learn something new, learn something that you want to learn, not just the stuff that your teachers have assigned for you, since you have all this free time all of a sudden. I hope that you are, I hope that you're using this time to better yourselves. That you're using this time to better yourselves and doing something with it. All right, so I might move a little bit fast here. This is a relatively short chapter, so I just want to go over the slides with you, and I will put this slideshow up into the classroom when I am done with the live stream on Thursday, so y'all can get a chance to look at it there and go along with it with my recording. Here's a typical scene of slavery in the South before the Civil War. Photography was just coming into its formative days in this time period. So we start seeing photographs of people in the 1840s. We start seeing photographs of prominent Americans, photographs of presidents. I think the first president to get their photograph taken in the 1840s was John Quincy Adams. Of course, he wasn't president anymore, but he was the first president to have his photograph taken. As we get closer to the Civil War, photography really matures really quickly, and it documents the war. So, kind of surprisingly, or not surprisingly, they took pictures of everything they could because it was such a new technology. Like when you get a brand new app on your phone or something and you just try all the features out. So they're taking pictures of everything, and a lot of the things they took pictures of was everyday life of people because it was the first time it had ever been documented. And here is a photograph of slaves coming out of the field in South Carolina carrying cotton sacks on their heads. Now, I actually think that this photograph wasn't taken before the Civil War. I think that this was a staged photograph that was done after the war. Judging from the way that the women are dressed, they're kind of dressed a little bit nicer than what you would expect slaves to be dressed as. And the men are wearing, three-piece clothing sets. This man right here is wearing a three-piece trouser, waistcoat, and jacket over it all. So is this man. So they're a bit better dressed than like workers. But again, new technology. So cotton was the king of agriculture in the United States. We're not just talking about southern agriculture. We're talking about the entire United States. And it created a pretty barbaric system around it. What's surprising here is that when the American Revolution took place and prominent early founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson actually debated and dabbled with the idea of destroying slavery in the United States, of getting rid of the slave system, they weren't necessarily doing it because it was the right thing to do. They were doing it because slaves were really expensive. And if they could have made the decision back in 1780 to free all the slaves and end slavery in the United States, it would have been to their financial advantage because of the cash crops that slaves produced. Tobacco was the most prosperous, and that was it. Indigo wasn't as prosperous, rice wasn't as prosperous, so you were really taking a huge financial risk by owning slaves. Until 1793. In 1793, a man named Eli Whitney developed the cotton gin. And the cotton gin is a machine that is able to comb the cotton and to straighten out the fibers, enabling it to be spun into yarn and then woven into cloth. It takes a lot of the human labor out of processing cotton and created a new industry. Now, all of a sudden, cotton was the cash crop that could replace tobacco in most of the South and perpetuate slavery across the United States. It's just like the old toaster thing. How many toasters can you make before the system collapses? Well, in cotton, how much cotton can you make? How much cotton can you grow before it collapses the economy? And the only thing you can do is just keep growing more cotton, because the more cotton you have, the more money you'll make, even if it lowers the price for everybody else. And so to grow more cotton, you have to buy more slaves. You have to buy more land. The more slaves and the more land you have, the more cotton you can produce. The more cotton you produce, the more you sell, the more you can buy slaves and land. Northern shippers. Northerners are not... here we go again with the toasters. Northerners are not immune from this. They are making huge amounts of money by taking that cotton from southern producers and shipping it over to England to be made into cloth for the English Empire. And so the prosperity of the North, the South, and England all rested on the backs of slaves. and so did our nation's wealth. Cotton, all right, the fiber. Go to your medicine cabinet, go to your bathroom pantry, and pull out a bag of cotton balls. Cotton accounted for half the value of all American exports in this time period. Half of the nation's GDP was cotton. Cotton export earnings provided capital for the Republic's economic growth. The South provided half the world's supply of cotton. The English cotton mills could not have produced without Southern cotton. 75% of England's cotton came from the South, and about 1/5, 20% of England's population worked in the textiles industry. Southern leaders knew that Britain was tied to them by cotton threads. And it's kind of interesting. If you remember when we were talking about the President Madison and Jefferson and Adams time period, it was the northern shippers who were closely related to Britain, but it quickly turned to Southern Republicans being tied to Britain because of cotton and because that's where their wealth was coming from. So the two kind of switch. This dependence on Southern cloth or Southern cotton gave the South power. Northern textile mills could not work if cotton was not produced by the South. They could not sell their cloth if cotton was not produced by the South. So in the South's eyes, cotton was king and the South was the prince of the land. Here's a picture. This painting actually takes place after the Civil War, but it's an all too familiar scene for the South. This is a Cotton Bureau office where you have men investigating. They're looking at strands of cotton fiber to determine its quality and to determine its price. And you have men waiting around to find out what the price of cotton was going to be. As cotton cultivation spread into the new states and into the Trans-Appalachian Southwest, the entire cotton kingdom paid its tribute to New Orleans, which was the Queen City of the South, and the port through which millions of cotton bales flowed out to British textile mills. So if you have all of this money, if you have all of this wealth being generated by the South, who actually owned the wealth? Well, it was an aristocracy. It was an aristocracy. If you know anything about ocracies, an aristocracy is the... Oh, hi, Anastasia. My dog just joined our lecture. The South was a planter aristocracy. In 1850, only 1,700 families owned more than 100 slaves. And you're thinking a population of the South was about 600,000 people. No, that's wrong. The South had about 4 million, 5 million people at the time of the Civil War. And so 1,700 is a very, very small minority of people in the South. It was a very select group of political and social leadership. They had most of the wealth in the South. They educated their children in the finest schools, often overseas or in boarding schools. And the money provided leisure for study, reflection, and statecraft. You look at John C. Calhoun, one of the most famous Southern congressmen and statesmen of the 1800s. He was from South Carolina, but he went to Yale University in Connecticut. Jefferson Davis, who would become the future president of the Confederate States of America, He was an officer candidate at West Point. These Southern gentlemen, as they were growing up, they felt a keen sense of obligation to serve. Robert E. Lee, we're going to go ahead and throw Bobby Lee out here. He went to West Point, and he was a devoted American soldier up until secession from the United States, when he felt a stronger obligation to his state of Virginia rather than to the United States. There was a dominance by a favored aristocracy that was basically undemocratic. There was a huge gap between rich and poor. Because there was such a small portion of the society that had the wealth versus a huge proportion of the population that had no wealth, that put long-term nails in the coffin of public education. Public education, of schools, things like that are supported by the taxpayers, did not exist in the South, outside of a few examples in the big cities of the South. On the plantations that are 10, 15 miles apart from each other, you can't have a public education system. And so you would end up hiring tutors to tutor your children, and it's all a very independent system. And this idealized feudalism in medieval Europe, the ideas of King Arthur and his court of knights and his round table, those became very popular ideas in the South. You'll hear white men being described as chivalrous during this time period. Chivalry, which literally is like the days of the knights of Europe. The plantation system shaped the lives of Southern women. Mistresses commanded sizable household staff. In no other part of the country were women running things like in the South. The mistress of the house, so the woman who was the wife of the slave master, she not only handled the affairs of her children, she also handled the affairs of all of her household slaves and any like garden and inside yard slaves. Not the ones out in the field doing the heavy work of cotton production or logging or things like that. But, 14, 15 people working under a woman was kind of unheard of in this time period. And then the relationship between mistresses and slaves ranged from affectionate to atrocious. There are plenty of examples of the good old kind-hearted Southern belle, mistress of a plantation, who treated her slaves benevolently and spoke fondly of them. And then there's people like, that crazy woman that they referenced in, what's that show on FX? Oh, gosh darn it. Hey, honey! What's that show on FX that you like to watch? The one with the murder house and all that. Yeah, there we go. American Horror Story. The American Horror Story season that took place in New Orleans a couple years back. You had a woman on there who was a slave owner back in the old days, back in the pre-Civil War days, 1840 or 1830s actually. And she mistreated her slaves. She tortured them, and all sorts of bad stuff happened to them. That's based on a real story. Like, let's see here. Her name was LaLaurie, Madame LaLaurie. And that was all based on a real story. So, remember, we're talking about the ownership of people, which is bad in and of itself. And then sometimes people get a power trip whenever they have power over other people. Here's the idealistic typical plantation scene of this time period. You have people, you have men and women working in the field. It wasn't just a man's job. If you were a woman and you could tow a cotton sack, you were out in the field also. You have this beautiful steamship off in the distance. So here's kind of your typical slave days view. Some women showed a tender regard for their bondswomen, for their slaves, like we already talked about. Some slave women took pride in the status as being members of the household. If you were the cook for the family, you got special privileges. You ate what the family ate. You weren't one of the outside slaves. But there was virtually no slaveholding woman who believed in abolition. They might have been the nicest, treated their slaves great, almost like part of the family, but not part of the family. And there wasn't a single one of them who would just say, you know what, we should just get rid of slavery. Because all that work then goes back on them. So, anyway. Is anybody else screen loading? Did it pause? So plantation life was agricultural based, of course. And just like with tobacco, it ruined the earth really quickly. Whenever you grow just one type of crop over and over and over again, you deplete the soil of its nutrients and you make it barren. Let's see here. Let's address this screen loading issue. Okay. All right, Chris. Thank you, Lantre, for giving me feedback on that. I'm just doing slides, so the frames should be fine. I'm just mostly concerned about the audio dropping out. So anyway, whenever you spoil the land, whenever you grow cotton or tobacco or corn even, whenever you grow the same thing over and over and over again, you deplete the soil and you take all the nutrients out of it. And so the only way to, at this time period, the only way to keep making money at growing cotton was to keep moving on to get more land. So that caused a population to leave for the West and for the Northwest to go and try to open up those new lands from the Louisiana Purchase and to be able to go and take their slaveocracy with them. The economic structure of the South became increasingly monopolistic because small farmers could no longer compete against the big plantations, and so they often sold out. And when they sold their land to the bigger got bigger, and the small got smaller, and they left and they went west. Also, there was a financial instability over the plantation system. You had an overspeculation in land prices and slave prices. Slaves were heavy investment of capital. All right. So when you think back at this, at that 1700 number, when you think back to that 1700, that's a lot of money. And we're looking at something that, the average slave could go for anywhere between $800 to $1,200 in this time period. A good, quote-unquote, hard-working, strong-backed slave could go upwards of $2,000. So we're looking at a situation where if you look at the money, if you take the money from 1850 and you put it in 2020 money, you're looking at an investment of anywhere between $35,000 to $70,000. You're talking about a King Ranch Truck Edition Ford F-150 Super Cab. You're looking at almost the price of my house for one slave. And so getting that slave represented a huge investment. And then they might all die from disease after you bought them. They could die from the same diseases that we caught. They could die from overexposure in the elements, and they could just run away. The dominance of cotton led to a dangerous dependence on a one-crop economy, and so cotton prices were at the mercy of world conditions. Cotton doesn't just spoil from one year to the next. If you have a really good crop of cotton this year, and the cotton mills don't go through it all, they don't need as much cotton next year because they already have some left over. So other places also grew cotton. The British Empire started growing cotton in Egypt and in India, especially close to the Civil War when Southern cotton petered out. And that whole system discouraged healthy diversification because you couldn't make money growing other things, so why do it? And so everybody just grew cotton, and when cotton prices were up, everything was good. And when cotton prices were down, people lost their homes. Southerners, of course, resented the North because they felt like the North was growing fat at their expense, when in reality, the Southerners weren't investing in their own infrastructure as well. The North was taking the raw material that the South was producing and making it into yarn and into cloth, and later into clothing. The Southerners could have done that too. They could have opened their own factories in the South like they tried to do later. They could have opened up their own industrial centers and done the same thing that the North did. But they shot themselves in the foot by keeping this hierarchical slave aristocracy system in place. Cotton, like just the existence of slavery in the South, repelled large-scale European immigration. Most of all the immigrants who came to the United States in this time period came to the North. They landed in New York, in Philadelphia, in even New England. In 1860, only 4.4% of the South was foreign-born, and that was mostly from like Germany. We had a pretty large German population here in Texas before the Civil War. And that was compared to 18.7% for the North. German and Irish immigration to the South was discouraged by competition with slave labor. Like, if you could get work for free from a slave, why would you pay somebody else to do it? The land was too expensive for them to buy and farm, except in Texas, of course, because Texas had a lot of land in the hill country that wasn't necessarily suitable for slave farming, but it was good for European-style farming. And European ignorance of cotton farming. They didn't know how to grow cotton, so why would they come to the South? Farmers from Europe were experienced with growing wheat and barley and staple grains, not cash crop grains. And so during this time period, the South became the most Anglo-centric part of the United States, the most quote-unquote genetically pure part of the United States, maintaining a deep connection to their Anglo-Saxon origins as English immigrants back in the 1700s. There was a white majority, obviously. There was only a handful of Southern whites who lived in the Grecian pillared mansions that we think about when it comes to like Gone with the Wind or some other plantation style place. Only 1,733 families owned 100 or more slaves, and that is figure 16.1 in your book on page 257, where it breaks this down. Of most of the slave owners had fewer than 10 slaves. Like there were 81,000 who owned between 5 and 9 slaves, 105,000 who owned 2 to 4 slaves, and 69,000 who owned 1 slave. I mean, you're not going to be doing very much farm work with 1 slave. You're not going to be doing much farm work with 2 slaves. Smaller slave owners didn't own the majority of slaves because even the families who owned more than 100 slaves, they still owned the most of the slaves, but there were more small owners than big owners. Those lesser masters were typically small farmers. They had very small, maybe 100-acre operations, 40-acre operations, where one person can't farm it all, and so they buy a slave. Okay, they don't hire people to work for them. They buy a slave. Here's that chart that is on page, and I got the page number wrong here, but page 257. So if you look at this, this top half here, we're looking at 17, almost 18,000 slaves, maybe anywhere between 3,000 to 30,000 to 60,000, somewhere in here. We're talking about a lot of slaves in this very small population right here, but the most of the owners were down here in the low ownership range. Underneath the slave owners was a big population of whites who owned no slaves at all. Not every single Southerner owned a slave. Most of the men who fought for the South in the Civil War did not come from slave-owning families. Only a quarter of white Southerners owned slaves or belonged to a slave-owning family. Most farmers in the South were just white subsistence food farmers, and they weren't even part of the cotton economy because they didn't have land to grow cotton. They were doing good just to grow some corn to be able to make it through winter. And they were doing good just to be able to cut some extra wood to be able to sell at the market, to be able to buy the things that they can't grow on their farm. That's what subsistence is. Whites without slaves had no direct economic stake in slavery, but they vehemently defended the slave system. And why? Because it was the American dream to own a slave. Not necessarily because of slave ownership, because it meant you were prosperous. If you didn't have a slave, you had the aspiration, You had the hope that one day you could afford to buy a slave and make it to that next level of prosperity of being able to take some chores off of yourself and being able to plant more crops and be more prosperous the next year and the next year and the next year. Then on top of that, there was a presumed racial superiority of whites over blacks, that it was the right thing to do to enslave blacks because they couldn't support themselves. All sorts of racist arguments like that. And then the logic of economics, like the more slaves you have, the more land you can produce, joined with the illogic of racism to buttress the slave system. The two arguments, the one logical and the one illogical, fed into each other to create a unbreakable bond of slave ideology before the Civil War. There was a special category of white Southerners who did not fit into this role. These were mostly the mountain whites, the ones who lived in the valleys and in the hard scrabble rocky top areas of the Appalachians of Tennessee and of West Virginia. They had little in common with whites of the flatlands. And when the Civil War finally came, most of the mountain whites constituted a peninsula of unionism. They supported the Union. West Virginia broke off from Virginia to become a new state in the United States. The president who came after Lincoln, Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson, is one of those mountain whites from Tennessee who had felt like he had been abandoned by the Democratic Party. And after the Civil War, they were the only solidly Republican areas of the South. Here's a map. It's the same one that's on page 258 in your book. But you can see in 1820, actually this isn't the same one that's in your book. This is a different version of the map. This map right here shows places that produced cotton in 1820 and in 1860. You can see that it is mostly grown by 1860 in these very small concentrated areas here, where there's flat land and rich alluvial soil to grow cotton in. And by 1860, a lot of the a lot of plantation population has left the east and has moved down to the south. This is the map that's in your book on page 258, and this is percentage of slaves in total population of your county. You can see here in 1820 that it's densely populated with slaves in Virginia, and by 1860 that density has gone down a bit because it all shifts out here into the south. If you know anything about your maps, right here is Wharton County on this map right here. And this map right here shows us as having between over 50% slaves. Right here, over 50% slaves. There's another map from 1860 that was the one that actually influenced Abraham Lincoln, and I should have put it in here because I just thought of it. And it showed Wharton County as having over 80% slave population in 1860. That's our past. That's our heritage. There was a small number of people, black people in the South, who were free blacks without any master whatsoever. By 1860, there were about 250,000 free blacks. Some of them came all the way back from the time of the Civil War. I'm sorry, from the American Revolution, when Republican-minded slave masters emancipated their slaves because of the idealism of the Revolution. In the lower South, most of them were mulattoes. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, mulatto is mixed. Okay, in this case, mixed between a mix between white slave masters and black enslaved women and the children they produce, like Thomas Jefferson's children with his slave Sally Hemings, who herself was mixed. Some slave masters freed the children who they had with black mistresses and gave them a trade or gave them a job, gave them some way to make their money, but never like put them in line to own anything. You know, they made sure that they could produce for themselves. Some purchased their freedom. Sam Houston owned many slaves. He had, in Huntsville. Well, I wouldn't say many. He wasn't like in the hundreds category, but he was down in the 10 to 15 category. And several of his slaves purchased their freedom and became family friends of the Houstons. So race and slavery, it wasn't a one-size-fits-all type thing. Many free blacks owned their own property, but they were kind of a third race. Because of their color, they were banned from certain occupations. Because of their color, they were constantly under threat of being hijacked into slavery. Even if they had been born free, you could be bushwhacked by slave rustlers, and you could basically have a sack put over your head and thrown into the back of a wagon, and by the time you ended up at the end of your trip, you would be down in Mississippi being sold at a slave auction. That's the kind of world that free blacks lived in, and they weren't safe even in the North. You could still be captured and sold into slavery. In the North, it wasn't exactly a great place for them to be either. There wasn't an idea of slavery being bad so much in the North as we just don't want free blacks here either. Several states in the North forbade their entrance into the states. Most were denied the right to vote, so even if you were free, you weren't allowed to vote. Some states and some places prohibited free blacks from attending public schools. Northern blacks were particularly hated by the Irish immigrants because the two groups competed for menial jobs. And there were anti-black feelings in the North that were way stronger than in the South. Like, this is something I can attest to. I've been in the North. I've been to New York State. And the kind of racism that is up there is totally unstomachable compared to the racism that we have to accept down here. It's just a different kind of racism, and I can't quite put my finger on it because it's so different from what we experience here. Southern whites had this weird dichotomy of lifestyle where they liked blacks as individuals. You had blacks who worked with your family for your entire life. White children raised on the knees of black nursemaids and nannies. You trusted these people in your life. You liked them as individuals, but you despised the race. Northern whites, on the other hand, professed to like the race, but disliked the individuals whenever they tried to get the rights for themselves. It's a weird weird, different place. We are going to stop in about 5 minutes or so, just so that we can limit this video to a manageable length. So let's go ahead and knock out this slide. Lantre, you just asked how did the slaves get their money? What they would do is they would work jobs after hours, like Sam Houston, slave Temple Houston. No, not Temple. Temple was one of his children. Gosh darn it, I can't remember. Joshua. Sam Houston's slave Joshua was a blacksmith. He was a trained blacksmith. And Sam Houston would allow him to take jobs of his own. And Sam Houston was gone a lot. He was a senator for most of the 1850s from Texas to Washington, D.C. So he was gone quite a bit. Joshua took on jobs whenever he wasn't busy working for Houston, and he earned enough money to buy his freedom and his family's freedom, and then continued to work for Houston as a free man. It wasn't an impossible thing to buy your freedom. You just had to have, it was a financial investment. If I paid $800 for a slave, am I going to take just $800 to grant you your freedom? No, I want to make a profit because it's a business. So you're going to have to come up with $1,000 or $1,200 or $1,500 to buy your freedom because it's a business. And it's tough to say it like that, but it's a financial investment to buy a person. And so they would have to work jobs outside of their normal everyday tasks to be able to earn that money. And if you didn't have a skill, and were just a slave hand in the fields, you weren't going to make that money to buy your freedom. You had to go take it yourself. Anyway, I hope that answered your question. Let's go back to this last slide here, and then I'll answer any other questions after this slide. In the South of 1860, there were nearly 4 million slaves. Legal importation of African slaves into America ended in 1808 by Congress. Actually, that's not exactly true because slaves were allowed to be brought into New Orleans for several more years after that because New Orleans had been bought from France. And so they were operating under a different legal system for the first couple years of the Louisiana Purchase. But slaves were illegal to be brought into the United States. Uh-oh. Did y'all's stream stop? Mm-hmm. Do y'all have any questions? All right. Well, little bit of technical difficulty. The stream stopped just as I was fixing to start talking about um, how slaves came to the United States after it was made illegal. But we'll go ahead and close it for today. I will do another live stream on um, Thursday morning at 10, and we'll finish up this chapter. Remember that you have work already assigned to you on Google Classroom, and that you also have Blackboard assignments already given to you for the dual credit students. You have a midterm that you have to take on Blackboard if you're a dual credit student, and you have a midterm to take on Google Classroom. You have a midterm to take on Google Classroom if you are an honor student. So I want you to be aware of those things. You have book work to do for this week and to turn in on Google Classroom. And I hope that you stay safe, that you wash your hands, that you limit your contact with people outside of your house, and that you remain safe over this quarantine time period. You are living through history right now, and the things that happen over the next couple weeks will determine whether we're on the right side of history or whether we were overly cautious and crashed the world in the process. So, can't wait to see y'all again. Bye.